How's it going, guys? It's Chris Salazar here with LOBO Off-Road. Today we're going to be installing the Hidden Winch Skid on a 2.7 Bronco. We do have to say that one of the requirements for this package is the MISHIMOTO high mount intercooler kit. Before we get started, we're going to go ahead and review everything that comes in our side of the kit. Starting over here is the heat exchanger relocation bracket. Included in the relocation bracket is 2 additional tabs as well as the hardware needed. The 2 additional tabs is one's for the passenger side to relocate the brake line. The other bracket relocates the brake line as well as mounts the water pump for the heat exchanger. Moving on to the winch skid, as you see, we have the main winch plate itself, the mounts, and all hardware needed. That'll conclude all the parts that are included on our side of the kit. To speed up the process on this video, we provided a link below to MISHIMOTO's high mount intercooler kit instructions. Now that the MISHIMOTO high mount intercooler kit is installed, we're going to go ahead and remove the factory intercooler mount / skid plate mounts with a 15mm socket or wrench. So now, as you can see in front of you, we took off the factory heat exchanger and skid plate mount, and you see the provided one next to it. Now that we have the brackets removed, we can go ahead and install our provided bracket. One thing that I do recommend is that you guys clean the threads with the wire brush and some brake clean, apply some blue Loctite, and go ahead and put them in the frame horn. As you can see on our bracket, we have 2 slotted holes so that you can get the bolts as far as you can in, which is roughly about 1/4 inch. And then you can go ahead and put the bracket in. So now that we have both skid plate mounting brackets on, we can go ahead and install the provided nut clips or extruded nut clips to the bracket. As you can see here on the extruded U-nuts, one side is longer than the other. The longer side needs to go inward. Now that we're done with the driver's side, we're going to go ahead and repeat putting the clips on these 3 holes on the passenger side. Moving on, we're going to go ahead and unbolt the heat exchanger. You see that we have 2 10mm head bolts here and then 2 on top. On top, there's also an 8mm head bolt holding the wire harness to the heat exchanger mount itself. In addition to the 4 10mm head bolts and the 8mm head bolt holding the wire harness, there is a plastic clip holding the wire harness on the passenger side that you need to undo. Now that all the hardware is removed and the clips holding the wire harness are detached, we're going to go ahead and pull the heat exchanger out. Now we're going to go ahead and cut these brackets off. We're going to probably leave about 1/4 inch. Now that we have the heat exchanger mounts cut off and they're all cleaned up so nobody's going to cut themselves, we're going to go ahead and install the heat exchanger in the provided bracket that is going to mount in these slotted holes on the winch skid mounts. You can see the 2 rectangle holes in the bottom that the mounts will slide into. So now that we have the heat exchanger and the mount in its general place, go ahead and verify before you put the top mount on that the old mounts are in the rectangle cutouts in the bracket. We can go ahead and install the top plate. When installing the top plate, you're going to go ahead and use 4 of the 10mm head bolts and nylocks that we provided to mount the top plate to the mounting bracket. We're going to go ahead and install the mounting bracket to the winch skid main mounts. We're going to use the 15mm head bolts that we provide to go ahead and do so. There's 1 on each side. Go ahead and tighten those down. Now that the heat exchanger and the mounting bracket are in place and final tightened, unbolt the bracket because we no longer need it. We're going to go ahead and unbolt the water pump from its bracket. Make sure to save the hardware for these brackets as we reuse them for the new brackets. Now that we have the brake line brackets removed, go ahead and put some blue Loctite on the existing hardware and then go ahead and install the provided brackets. Now that the bracket is installed, go ahead and use the standoff for the brake line and go ahead and pop it into the bracket. So now with the tape on the vice grips, we're going to go ahead and clamp the hose about 8 to 10 inches above the water pump. By doing so, we're not going to make the giant mess, and then we can go ahead and disconnect the top line of the water pump and disconnect it, get it out of the way, and then we can go ahead and mount the water pump, trim that top line, put it back on, and keep moving forward. We're going to go ahead and disconnect the line feeding into the top of the water pump. As you can see, there's a connector connecting the two lines together. We can go ahead and clamp it right underneath that connector. Now that we have the top line clamped, we're going to go ahead and clamp the other line just so that the water doesn't backfeed through the pump as we have it open. Now that we have both lines clamped with the drain pan underneath, we can go ahead and undo the clamp to the top line. We can go ahead and install the water pump on the bracket, as it's easier to do it now versus when it's up in place. We are using the provided 10mm head bolts and nylogs. One note we want to say is that this water line, the outlet, needs to be facing forward to the front of the vehicle. Now we're going to go ahead and put the water pump and the bracket in its location. We need to cut the zip tie holding the electrical plug line to the brake line standoff first. Now we're going to go ahead and install the water pump and the bracket in its location. So go ahead and slip the bracket behind the brake line. Like so. Now, again, with blue Loctite, use the old hardware from the old bracket and go ahead and tighten that up. Now that we have the mounting bracket for the water pump and the standoff for the brake line in place, we can go ahead and plug in the wire to the water pump. Now that we have the water pump in place, we can go ahead and cut the top water line to length and reconnect it. As you can see here, the water line has a sharp bend right where it used to connect to the water pump, and then a slight jog back. Well, in that slight jog, right at the end of the bend is where we're going to cut the water line. Now that we have the top water line on with the clamp in place, we can go ahead and disconnect both vice grip clamps. So now that we have the top line and the clamp in place, what I do like to do is loosen the clamp going off the front water line in order to let the line sit natural and not be twisted and kinked. We can go ahead and move forward on removing these two front frame horns in order to get the winch in place. So as you can see, there's a weld on each side. So just cut along the weld, try not to cut into the cross member, and then cut the tab on the top. Now that we cut the sheet metal horns off and cleaned them up and painted the raw material, it's time to go ahead and install the winch on the skid as well as the winch skid plate in its final location. One thing I do want to point out is on these steel skid plates, there is not a hole right here for this optional threaded hole that's already in the cross member. So on the plastic skids, they use this location as well as this location to mount the skid, but on these steel ones, it does not have this hole. With that being said, you do have the option to mock up the winch skid to trace out this hole, pull this skid plate off, drill the hole, and then reinstall everything, or just don't use that hole. You can use this outer one, and these two are more than sufficient. Moving forward, we're gonna go ahead and prep this for the winch skid to be installed. We need to remove these two 18mm headed bolts that is your diff mount, because the winch skid uses these as two mounting bolts. While we're here, we can also add back one of the factory skid plate bolts here, as the winch skid does not go here. So make sure to put blue Loctite on it and go ahead and install. All right, now that we got the winch skid in place, you can go ahead and install the 6mm headed Allens that we provide, 3 on each side. Make sure to blue Loctite them, as well as the 2 diff bolts and the 2 or 1 skid plate bolts that were on the OEM skid. The one thing I do recommend is the 2 diff bolts, clean them and put red Loctite. Now that you have the skid plate mounted, go back, make sure that no lines are getting rubbed on or pinched or so on. As you can see that we use the Xeon winch, that does require the solenoid relocation kit. So just take note of that depending on which winch you're installing. But that will complete the install. Now go ahead and put your bumper on. Once you have this kit installed, make sure to take some photos and tag us on social medias, as we would love to see your guys' builds. Thank you for watching.